Hello and welcome to No Holding Back with me, Susan Estridge. Each week I have the privilege of talking with some of the biggest names from the worlds of media, politics, and law. Nothing is off the table. I'll be speaking my mind and encouraging my guests to do so too. Today I'm joined by one of my oldest friends, oldest meaning long-term friends, Alan Dershowitz, who is all over the news these days with what's going on, and I'm deeply concerned about, especially what's going on the college campuses, Alan. You've been writing about it and blogging about it and texting about it. And I wonder if you can bring us up to date on what you think is going on, because it's very scary and out of control.
Sure, but I'm not only one of your longest term friends, I'm also one of your oldest. I'm 85 years old and still hopefully actively involved in trying to bring about some degree of justice. And what we have on campus, of course, is a classic clash between First Amendment rights of expression. People are entitled to, within the law, protest what's going on in Gaza and even call for horrible things like the end of Israel. That's their right. But they have to comply with the rules of the university, rules of law. They can't take over a campus and prevent students from going to class and threaten students and intimidate students. And mostly university presidents have not done a great job in trying to strike balance. University presidents also have an obligation to do exactly the same thing in terms of these protests as they would do if the protests were directed against Black people or gay people. Can you imagine any university campus tolerating a call for raping of gays or lynching of Blacks? Of course they wouldn't. And that's what some of these, not all, but some of these protesters are calling for when they say, we are Hamas. They're saying we are terrorists. When they're saying that we applaud the Hamas rockets, or we want to see a repetition of October 7th 10,000 times, or Jews don't deserve to live. If anybody said any of those things about any other group, they would be condemned by the court of public opinion, canceled, and perhaps even suspended by universities. But apparently there are different rules when it comes to Jews, particularly because an organization called Jewish Voice for Peace has done a terrible, terrible, misleading job of pretending that they are Jews that are in favor of these horrible demonstrations. I've done some research into Jewish Voice for Peace. It is not a Jewish organization. Most of its members are not Jewish. It uses the name Jewish in order to give them cover. They don't use their voice, they use violence, and they're not in favor of peace. But when you have CNN interviewing, oh, I'm Jewish, I'm a member of Jewish Voice for Peace, it sounds like the Jewish community is deeply divided on the issue. Like on any issue, the Jewish community is divided. It's divided on every issue. But the vast majority of not only Jews, but Christians, and the vast majority of students do not support these calls for genocide against the Jews and these calls for Jews don't deserve to live. So what I worry about mostly are two things. Number one, the future. I worry the long distance future. A lot of these kids are now knee-jerk anti-Israel. Forget about the rhetoric. And when they become members of Congress, as they will, indeed, even the student who was suspended from Columbia, who said Zionists don't deserve to live, he said his goal is to get into Congress and join the squad. But that's one long-term issue. I'm also worried a little bit about a short-term future problem. You're not old enough to remember this, but I was deeply involved in the anti-war protests in the 1960s and 1970s. I represented almost all of the kids at Harvard who were disciplined, and many of the kids from other schools. I was involved in the Chicago 7 case, the Dr. Spock case. So I represented a lot of these protesters. Some of them, a small percentage, but some of them changed from becoming protesters to becoming terrorists. Kathy Boudin, Bernadette Dorn. And it's certainly possible that within these agitators, now I'm talking about the students now, but the outside agitators are a potential fifth column of people who, when Hamas comes to America, and they will if they've come to Europe, may join and may turn from just protesting to planting bombs, as the Weathermen did at the University of Wisconsin, at libraries, at Fort Dix, in the case where Kathy Boudin was convicted of murdering two police officers and two Brinks guards. And guess where she ended up after she served her term? She ended up teaching at Columbia. no surprise there. And she may very well have taught some of these students. I don't know. I knew Kathy Boudin as a college student, and she was a decent young woman with great parents. And her brother, we all know her brother, who was a great judge. But she became a terrorist. And I'm worried that some of these kids that are demonstrating today against Israel might very well make that leap from protester to terrorist.
How did Hamas end up winning the war here? It's really scary to look at and to realize that Hamas has made such inroads here that even the opposition leaders in Israel are tired of defending themselves against Hamas attacks coming from the United States.
I wrote about this 20 years ago. Hamas wins every war. And there are three letters that explain why. CNN. They call it the CNN strategy. It's very simple. They kill as many Jews as they possibly can, women, children, they rape, they do all of these things. Then they know Israel will respond. They put their terrorists among civilians, knowing that Israel will kill civilians. They're ready to bring the civilians in front of the TV cameras. And CNN shows these pictures without any explanation. Hamas wins every war. Terrorists win every war. I wrote a book called Why Terrorism Works. And terrorism works because of the media. If it bleeds, it bleeds. And terrorists understand this. And they know that democracies will always end up killing some civilians, and they're ready with the TV cameras. So this will happen again and again and again. And it will come to a theater near you. It's not only going to be limited to Israel and Gaza. There's already some terrorist Hamas bases in Europe, and they're coming to the United States. And as Elie Wiesel used to say, they go after the Jews first, but the Jews are never last. And when you have these signs that's saying death to America, we hate America, America is the devil, we know that Americans will be the target if Hamas is allowed to win, and Hamas is winning.
But there are Jewish kids on these campuses who are falling for this stuff. And it is just stunning to me to see the amount of hatred of Jews that they are playing into. I think it's much more than any of us assumed was there, and they're playing into it and they're succeeding. I don't know what to do. I feel powerless. What do you do?
I was thinking of writing a book entitled Palestinian Pied Pipers Are Leading Your Children from the River to the Sea. There is a direct effort to try to groom and to influence young kids, particularly but not exclusively Jewish kids, and turn them against their parents, turn them against Israel. I have a relative whose granddaughter has joined these demonstrations, and she doesn't know anything. She has no idea what river or what sea, but her friends are joining the demonstration and chanting and chanting. And as you know, you were a kid once, I was a kid once. People love to join demonstrations. I have a friend, you probably know, but I'm not going to mention his name. He was an extreme right-winger. He had been a member of the Jewish Defense League as a kid, and then he became an extreme left-winger. And I said, why did you turn from a left-winger, from a right-winger to a left-winger? He said, very easy. The sex was easier and the sex was better. That overstates it, obviously. But it's more fun to be in these demonstrations than to be a fuddy-duddy who wants to enforce the law and do a rational analysis of what's going on in the Middle East, where reasonable people could disagree or agree about so many of these things. So it's a phenomenon that has something to do with youth. This may affect your party. I mean, you were obviously the first woman ever to be the campaign manager for a presidential candidate, a great honor, and you did a great job. I wish your candidate had done a better job, but you did a great job. But the Democratic Party is being very deeply divided, particularly young people. 19% of young people support President Biden in his policies toward the Middle East and what's going on college campuses today. He's going to have a hard time winning the election with that division among Democrats. And I think
terrible. It's just terrible. But what do you do about it?
Look, if I were 25 years old, I'd be in Gaza today, be in a tank volunteering. That's how strongly I feel about this. But I'm 85. And all I can do is write and talk and think and be on wonderful shows like yours and try to influence public opinion. And politically, a message has to be sent to both parties that you can no longer just count on our votes automatically. You have to earn our votes. And I hope that President Biden will earn my vote. I've never voted for a Republican candidate. I can't see myself ever voting for this particular Republican candidate. I've been friendly with Bobby Kennedy Jr. since he was a kid. And there are a lot of things about what he's saying I don't like. There are a lot of things about he's saying I do like. But I'm not giving my vote away to anybody at this point until I hear a lot more.
What should the university presidents be doing? It looks like USC has done everything wrong.
Everything wrong.
Everything wrong from beginning to end. But what should they be doing?
Let me tell you what they should not be doing. They should not be canceling graduation. They should not be doing what Columbia did, canceling classes. They should be doing what President Eisenhower did during the civil rights demonstration. Every Jewish kid who wants to go to class should be accompanied to class by as many armed guards as are necessary. There should be as many New York City policemen as necessary to keep the Columbia graduation going, as many policemen from Los Angeles to keep the USC. I mean, you know USC. You know that the vast majority of students at USC want to graduate, want to have a graduation.
And want to have a graduation. This is ridiculous that they're caving and there's no graduation. And they can't celebrate their graduation.
Yeah, and these are students who couldn't celebrate their high school graduation because of COVID.
Right.
Now they college, and it just means that the protesters win, and you can't do that because it just encourages people. Columbia University, the students are not leaving because they know that the president won't keep up their threat, and they know that if they're arrested, District Attorney Bragg will refuse to prosecute them. So the threats are hollow, and it's so interesting to hear the two of us. We're two liberals who usually are in favor of the demonstrators and against the police, and suddenly we're worrying about what happens when law and order is completely negated, and the protesters get to determine the rules of the game.
It's outrageous, but I feel, I keep saying I feel powerless. I write like you do, I talk like you do, but it's just, this is spreading, and it's spreading too quickly and too easily. And you wonder where these kids are coming from and how it is that they are so ignorant.
Yeah, well, they're coming from our homes. They're coming from our friends' homes. They're coming from decent backgrounds. Some of them are just bored. Some of them are just complying with peer pressure. Israel isn't doing everything right. And there is a legitimate basis for some criticism of some Israeli actions, as there is for criticism of the actions of every country. When we were, protesting American involvement in the Vietnam War, America wasn't doing everything perfectly, but we love America, and I love Israel as well, even though I'm critical of some of its actions and some of its leaders. But what else can we do as intellectuals, as people who care deeply about America, who love America? We have to keep writing and keep talking and keep educating. I don't know what else to do. I have a friend who's about to get an honorary doctorate at Columbia, and he called me. He got the doctorate because of his great contributions to science, and now he's afraid to go to the Columbia graduation and accept it. And his family is telling him not to accept it, that he may be hurt. Already, they announced that he was getting the degree, and because he was born in Israel, he's an American. Because he was born in Israel, the students are protesting him getting a degree. They're protesting two people at Columbia, both of whom are Jewish, because Jews shouldn't get honorary degrees, particularly if they have any connection to Israel at all. And so, it's not getting better. It's getting worse, and that's why it's important to keep talking and keep trying to influence people. But is anybody listening? That's the hard question.
And where is all this anti-Semitism coming from? Because it's reaching an audience that's much broader than I thought it.
Well, anti-Semitism has been the norm for the last 2,000 years. And it had a period of time, probably the period of time that we were active in academia, it happened to coincide with that, where we had a golden age, where there was no anti-Semitism for the most part when I taught it. When I started teaching at Harvard, there was, but it was old-fashioned Brahmin right-wing anti-Semitism.
Right, right. And it was quotas and it was keep limits on the number of Jews and all of that. When I went to Wellesley, there was a quota on Jews.
I remember that's right. Yeah, and was one of the last schools to maintain the quota. You'll
Right.
like this story. One day, the chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, Bailey Aldridge, called me and said, "We have a club. It's called the Club of Odd Volumes, and we always like to invite the new dons." I had never heard that word before. The new assistant professors to tell us about their work. We'd like to have you next Wednesday. I said, "Sure, I'd love to do it." The next day, I was sitting next to somebody from the Anti-Defamation League, and I said, "I'm going to the Club of Odd Volumes." And he said, "No, you're not. They restrict Jews. They'll let you in to speak, but they will never accept you as a member." So I called Bailey Aldridge and I said, "I'm sorry, I can't come. You're a club that restricts Jews." "Well, we're not inviting you to be a member. We're just inviting you to speak." I said, "No, I can't do it." Within 5 minutes, Dean Erwin Wisrold pops into my office and says, "You've offended one of our most important alumni. You are hurting your chances for tenure. Apologize and tell him you'll come." And I said, "No." And I didn't come. I got tenure, but there was that form of old-fashioned anti-Semitic from the top down. Now it's more from the bottom up, and it's a different type of anti-Semitism. Look, the president of the United States, Joe Biden, has condemned anti-Semitism openly, repeatedly. We don't have it from the very top, and that's a blessing. But it can spread. 10 years from now, that bottom can begin to go to the middle, and then 20 years from now to the top. I think it was Tom Friedman who said that Joe Biden may be the last Democrat pro-Israel president ever nominated. And there's that fear. And so, we're not Nazi Germany, and there'll never be another Holocaust because Israel has a strong army and indeed even nuclear weapons, and it would never tolerate anything like what happened in Germany between 1941 and 1945. But what we're seeing is not so different from what happened in Germany in 1933, where we see blockading Jewish students from coming in, students being discriminated against. And I think a lot of it, the fault lies with DEI, this diversity, equity, and inclusion, and intersectionality, and our former colleague Derek Bell's critical race theory, which is uncritical. And I'm worried that these academic formulations, in fact, many of the most anti-Semitic diatribes have come from DEI bureaucracies, ethnic studies departments, intersectionality, and critical race theory. So I'm worried that it's deeply embedded in the university bureaucracies, and it will be hard to remove.
I just shake my head in wonder at what is happening. Who's paying for this? Who's organizing this? You've been writing columns and sending out emails about this Jewish Voices for Peace. Who's behind that?
Well, it's an old-fashioned anarchist. We used to call them communists. We don't use those terms anymore, but these are very, very radical non-Jews who took the name Jewish Voice for Peace, and probably 20 or 30% of them are Jewish. They're funded by another Jew, Peter Beinart, who was a very...
What's his story? What's his story?
He was an Orthodox Jew. He went to Jewish school. I know him from Martha's Vineyard. I've debated him repeatedly in front of various organizations. He's turned viciously against Israel. He's now a trustee of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The Rockefellers, who were the old-fashioned anti-Semites of the right, now have become the new anti-Semites of the left. And the Rockefeller Fund, Brothers Fund, is one of the most supportive of anti-Semitic causes of any group, along with George Soros. They do it indirectly through their funds, but they fund organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace and some of the other groups that then fund Students for Justice in Palestine. You know, there used to be a day when we worked together. I don't remember, Susan, if you were at the school at Harvard at the time. I think you were not. But we had a situation when Yasser Arafat died. Harvard foolishly wouldn't allow Students for Justice for Palestine to put up the Palestinian flag at Harvard Yard. And who did they come to represent them? Me. And I said, I'm happy to represent you because I think you're right. You should be able to fly the flag. But let me tell you that when you have your ceremony in honoring Yasser Arafat, I will be there handing out leaflets about who Yasser Arafat was and what a mass murderer he was. And that event occurred. They flew the flag. We won the case. They flew the flag. They handed out their leaflets. I handed out my leaflets. And that was free speech on the Harvard campus. You know, there may be 100 people showed up and, 80 on one side and 20 on the other. But that's not what's happening today. There's no reason, debate, and discussion. When's the last time you heard a debate about the Middle East? Today, it's all slogans and shouting and insults and hate speech. There's something very, very dangerous about that.
And why is that happening? Why aren't there? I mean, I've heard of occasions, I think Dartmouth has had some actual debates and discussions and discourse. I mean, there are some schools that have tried to look for a way to have a legitimate debate and discussion about these issues. But most of them are either into the cancellation mode or into the, putting their heads in the sand mode. And they're just not doing anything. They're not protecting the Jewish students against harassment, and they're not disciplining the students who need to be disciplined.
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
you've gone wrong at Columbia.
Yeah, you'll appreciate this. I was at Harvard for 50 years and then emeritus for another 10. I cannot come to Harvard and speak. I have offered to debate people on the other side. No group will invite me to Harvard. The one group that invited me about 5 years ago, Chabad, had to take my speech out of the law school for fear of physical danger to me and move it to off campus 5 blocks away. I've offered to come to Harvard and speak to the Jewish students. They won't allow me to do it. This is not free speech. This is free speech for me, but not for thee. And so we're not having all sides presented. Let me tell you something else about our former colleagues. Not a single member of the Harvard Law School faculty, not one, not Noah Feldman, not one has stood up and spoken on behalf of the Jewish students. Not one.
It is Where's Martha Minow? Where's Martha Minow?
Martha Minow is very quietly trying to address things and be equivalent on both sides. But I haven't heard anybody like you or me or people who would have done it back in the day, who would have stood up and spoken on behalf of the Jewish students. I was invited to Columbia a few years ago to speak on behalf of Israel because they couldn't get a single faculty member, not a single one on the faculty to speak on behalf of Israel. So they had to go off campus and get me. Professors are scared, they're terrified, and they're not courageous. Our colleagues are not known for their courage. They want to get perfect student evaluations from everybody. You remember what happened when I started supporting Israel? I used to get the best student evaluations, other than you, but I would get very high student evaluations. And then I started defending Israel, and about 10% of the students start giving me zeros. So I got zeros in knowledge of the criminal law, zero in accessibility. I had an open door policy. I would have every student to my house for dinner. I took every student to lunch, but these students deliberately tried. And I remember the dean called me in and said, we see what's going on because we saw your evaluations. We wondered why they dropped. And then we saw zero for knowledge of the criminal laws, zero for accessibility to students. We know it was a plan to try to get your student evaluations down. Didn't work with me. I couldn't care less. But it
Who cares?
Professor, somebody who's trying to get tenure, or it works with some full professors who don't want to be disliked. Yeah.
And they're scary. I mean, you and I have both been in the public eye and we've gotten used to this stuff. but it's scarier now. It really is. And I understand why they're scared. I still don't respect it. I mean, there's times for coverage, and this is one of those times. But, I know when I was speaking, one of my classmates arranged for us to speak to the Jewish students at Wellesley on an informal basis. And, they told us that they had been advised by Hillel people not to mention Israel in any of their groups because it was dangerous. I mean,
Well,
this is insane.
I was told by a friend of mine who is very active in these matters that student guidance counselors who guide students about college applications, they tell students not to mention if you've been to Israel, not to mention if you've taken a semester abroad, not to mention you're a Zionist, not to mention that you support Israel. You can mention you're active in your synagogue. That's fine. But don't mention anything with regard to Israel in your college application. Otherwise, it could hurt you. On the other hand, I guarantee you that students from Muslim countries are told to emphasize the fact that they will bring diversity to the university through their Muslim and Arab backgrounds. And so there is a real double standard.
I find it all so shocking and disappointing. And I just wonder who are the university leaders who are handling this right? And what are they doing now?
Well, I would have thought that Peter Salovey at Yale would be handling it right, and he was for a while, and now he has capitulated. Harvard is without a president. Yale will.
An interim president who's Jewish. Does that make any difference?
He's very good. Alan Garber is very good, but he's an interim person, and he's just keeping watch. And actually, things are doing pretty well at Harvard. I spoke to our mutual friend Ron Sullivan today, and he said things are pretty good at Harvard. We're not seeing this kind of tension and animosity, particularly at the law school. But there is one professor at the law school who teaches first-year torts and was every day talking about anti-Israel stuff and tried to put some of it on his exam, and was told not to put anything about Israel-Palestine on his exam, a torts professor. So there is a little bit of a problem, but it's not nearly as much as it is at places like Columbia.
And why is Columbia so bad right now?
Always been bad. About 10 years ago, there was a man named Professor Joseph Massad who was up for tenure. And I opposed his tenure. This is before he got tenure because of the following incident. He had called on a student in the class, taught a class in the Middle East, in Israel. And so he called on a student in the class, and the student spoke, and he said, "I detect an Israeli accent. Are you Israeli?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "You are forbidden from speaking in my class unless you publicly admit that you have participated in the commission of war crimes." This is an assistant professor, and he got tenure after that. And he's the same professor who on October 7th talked about how thrilled he was and how happy he was with what happened on October 7th. But now he can't get fired because he has tenure. I was told by the then provost of Columbia University that the reason Joseph Massad got tenure was not because he was a scholar. He was not. He was a polemicist, but because it added diversity to have an anti-Israel voice on the Columbia faculty. And so he's been taking advantage of that for all of this time. And these specialized departments, these Middle East studies departments, are funded by Qatar, and they're funded by other Arab and Muslim states. And inevitably, they reflect points of view of those governments. Those governments don't contribute money and expect nothing in return.
Outrageous. Did you ever think you'd live to see this?
I never thought I would. I thought the trajectory was all in the right.
It's all positive in the right direction.
Yeah, but it hasn't been. And it's shocking. And it's going to get worse because these students now, without thinking, are all automatically going to be knee-jerk anti-Israel and knee-jerk suspicious of Jews who are Zionists. And I think we're seeing the trajectory moving in exactly the wrong direction. And we have to think hard about how to change that. And I'm not averse to having outside forces like contributors. They are a check and balance on the extreme left-wing orientation of some of these universities. And remember, universities are more than the current student body. They're the alumni, they're the future student body. They are people who care deeply. And I've been advising some alumni who are billionaires to condition their grants to universities on making sure that they're not used to foment anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
What do you do about CNN?
Not watch it for the most part. I mean, for me, CNN, I mean, the experts, the legal experts on CNN, if you listen to the legal experts on CNN, there's never been a stronger case in the history of law enforcement since the assassination of Lincoln, if it were on videotape, than the New York case against Donald Trump now, which nobody even understands what the crime is. You know, a misdemeanor, which is voided by the statute of limitations, and then it becomes a felony because he intended, when he failed to disclose the hush money, that he intended to break a federal law, which the federal government didn't think was broken. But CNN thinks this is the best case ever. And CNN presents a material on the Middle East story. They constantly show only the dead bodies of Palestinian children. They give all the data and statistics that Hamas gives out as true.
Right. The Gaza Health Authority, which is
Yeah.
Hamas,
Right.
manipulating the news.
And it's, you know, when you watch different channels, it's as if you're living in different worlds. And there's no Walter Cronkite today. Walter Cronkite couldn't get a job today because he's too objective and too neutral. What you have is one worldview presented by some channels, the other worldview presented by the other channels. And it's very hard. People write to me all the time and say, where do you go to get the truth? And the answer is you can't find it anywhere. You have to read a variety of newspapers and sources and really think for yourself. But how many people think for themselves today? Not enough.
It's just really something. I don't know what to do. What do you make of the Trump trial?
Well, the New York Trump trial is a sham. There's just no crime there. I don't get it. And I think it'll probably be reversed on appeal if there's a conviction based on the Harvey Weinstein reversal, which reversed on the ground that the court admitted too much evidence that was not directly the charges of women who were uncharged. I think that kind of reasoning carries over to what's going on in the New York Trump trial, where we're now, you know, several days into the trial. We haven't heard any evidence of any crime. All we've had evidence is that, you know, the National Enquirer did this, and Susan McDougal did this, and there was hush money paid. None of that's a crime. And so I think the appellate courts will look askance at that. But, you know, their goal is a down and dirty conviction before the election, even if there's a reversal after the election. So I'm not happy. I wrote a book called Get Trump about that. I'm not a Trump supporter, obviously, but I support the Constitution. And when it's violated, it doesn't matter to me who it's violated against. I'm going to be opposed to it.
I'm a little more sympathetic to the prosecution in that one. I understand the concern with the legal case. I think it's really unfortunate that that was the first one to go to trial and the only one to go to trial. And the Supreme Court in the immunity case really troubled me because they've just played into the delay, and that's a case that should go to trial. And what did you think of that argument?
Interesting. This is something nobody else, I think, has thought of. Maybe I'm being too self-referential. But when Trump's lawyer admitted that there are elements of the indictment that don't get immunity, for example, why didn't Jack Smith amend the indictment, get rid of everything in the indictment that dealt with public issues, and just re-indict on the 6 or 7 elements that Trump's lawyer officially on the record are not immunity? They could bring that trial next week.
Didn't Amy Coney Barrett ask that question? Why don't you just focus on the private actions and just go to trial on that? And the government lawyers said no, that we would still want everything else to come in.
Yeah, why? That's shocking. They could have 2 indictments. They could have an indictment just on the private trials, wait for the Supreme Court to decide the case. And then if the Supreme Court decides that they could include the public, they could have a second trial. There'd be a
Yeah,
move
why don't they do that?
because they're not as smart as you and me. And I
Because that
think
just jumped out at me that they had acknowledged that the private actions that he took as a as a candidate, not as president, that were not official actions, could be the basis that any immunity, no matter how broad they argued for, wouldn't cover actions that he took as a as a private candidate.
his own lawyer publicly admitted that on the record. That is a binding admission. And therefore, it would be easy to simply re-indict on those charges, seek a trial in the next few weeks, and probably get a conviction because it's in the District of Columbia, where obviously the jury pool would be very favorable to the prosecution. So I don't know why they didn't do that.
And they're not going to do it. And so the chances are that that one won't go to trial anytime soon.
That's right. And I think the likelihood, the same thing is true with the case in Georgia, where
Right.
is the one who should be on trial for what appeared to be perjurious testimony about when her affair started and whether she paid back every penny that was forwarded for her trips with her lover, who she hired to be the special prosecutor. So,
What a mess that was. What a
people
mess.
how did you win the O.J. Simpson case? And my answer is always, we didn't win the O.J. Simpson case. The prosecution lost it.
Lost it.
Do it at every occasion, trying the glove on in front of the jury when they could have had him try it on outside the presence of the jury, picking a jury from the inner city instead of from a
Santa
suburb.
Monica.
Everything they did was wrong. And we as defense attorneys, hey, if you do it wrong, we're going to take advantage of that. And so I think a lot of that's going on today, too. You'd think we taught law collectively for close to a century, and
Right.
you'd think we turned out better students than apparently we have.
It's unbelievable, Alan. I can't tell you how much I enjoy talking to you. I don't
Like,
agree with you on everything, but your passion always impresses me, and I just hope we can get through this. I hope you'll come back and talk to me again
I
about this.
love talking to you. I miss you. I wish we were still on the same coast and the same faculty.
I do
And
too,
let's
but I
spend some.
don't wish I was in a classroom right now. I really don't. I
Yeah,
think the campuses are a really bad place to be right now.
yeah. No, I agree with you. I'm so glad my grandchildren are all out of medical school and practicing and in the real world. So let's stay in touch and keep doing great things and
You too. And
keep
keep
America.
on top of this. Let's figure out a way through because, my kid says to me, my kid has a Jewish last name. My name is sort of,
Yeah,
hard to figure out. And he says it's horrible to be a Jew in this country right now.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's something I never thought I'd hear one of my kids say, that
yeah.
it's
No,
just scary to be a Jew here.
yeah, no, I agree with you. And I've heard of people now who want to change their names. When I was growing up, people changed their names, changed their noses, changed all
Right.
kinds of their Jewish identity. I thought those days were over, but they're
I
not.
do too, but they're not. You've been listening to No Holding Back with me, Susan Estrich. Thank you to Alan Dershowitz, as always, for a great conversation. Tweet us at No Holding Back FM, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share the link on social media. You can sign up to receive an email when a new episode drops at our website, noholdingback.fm. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time on No Holding Back.